the role that sugar sweetened beverages play in the global disease, in the global non-communicable disease burden is so vast that you could basically like chalk up almost 200,000 deaths to sugar sweetened beverages alone. All right, what happens if you stop eating sugar for 30 days?
Yeah, let's do it.
One of the major problems with the standard American diet is that sugar is insidious, that it's just everywhere.
Mm-hmm.
And manufacturers will use various types of sugar. They'll use cane sugar, they'll use coconut sugar, they'll use high fructose corn syrup, they'll use dextrose, they'll use date sugar. No matter what kind of sugar, essentially, functionally speaking, from biological standpoint, sugar is sugar. Certain sugars will cleave and become a glucose molecule and a fructose molecule, as I mentioned. Certain sugars are primarily fructose, like agave syrup, for example, is 70 to 80% fructose. But with the exception of overfeeding, most sugars generally have the same effect, with the exception of fructose. But the problem I think that most people will highlight with regard to fructose consumption is really the overconsumption of fructose that drives a lot of the problems that are associated with it. And fructose is primarily a fruit sugar, so it's found naturally in all whole fruits to varying quantities. Whole fruits generally contain glucose, fructose in some combination. They also contain sugar alcohols and other sugars. So it's basically like a sugar soup when you eat a whole fruit. But under isocaloric, eucaloric conditions, or eucaloric, I should say, conditions where we're not overfeeding, there really isn't a major consequence that I know of to consuming fructose, especially when fructose is contained in whole foods. The problem, as I mentioned, with sugar is that it's now added to innumerable ultra-processed food products to the degree that your average American now is consuming 77 grams of added sugar every single day, which, if you do the math, that's about 20 teaspoons of pure sugar that your average American is ingesting every day. And this is added sugar. So we have no biological requirement for added sugar. This is just the sugar that manufacturers are adding to packaged processed foods. So it's about 20 grams of, 20 teaspoons of pure sugar, which I think is really important for people to visualize. And if you net that out in terms of calories, that's just over 300 calories a day of extra sugar that people are consuming. It takes about 500 extra calories a day to add up to a pound of fat gain over the span of a week. I think a lot of people think that sugar drives weight gain. It's important to be clear up front that eating too many calories really drives weight gain. Whether those calories come from sugar or fat, it doesn't really make much of a difference. But the problem with added sugar is that it provides no satiety effect. So it doesn't fill you up. It doesn't slow digestion. We never tire of eating it. And it's empty calories that provides no nutritional benefit. There are no nutrients found in added sugar. We can talk about certain phytochemicals that might be found in sweeteners like maple syrup or honey. But again, for the most part, sugar is sugar.
Okay, so because at the beginning you mentioned that like sugar is a nutrient, but added sugar is not a
Correct.
nutrient.
Yeah, it can be tricky to try to wrap your head around this. We don't have any need for dietary sugar. So you don't need to consume any sugar or carbohydrates for that matter to survive. We have a daily requirement for protein and we have a daily requirement for certain fats, but there's no such thing as an essential carbohydrate, and sugar is a carbohydrate.
Okay.
When I say that it's essential, I mean that it's essential from the standpoint of the brain, but your body is a very elegant and highly adaptable chemistry set that can create sugar from the barest of ingredients. So we can create sugar from fat. This occurs when triglycerides are liberated from adipocytes or our fat cells. Triglycerides are 3 fatty acids bound to a glycerol molecule, and that glycerol molecule is a carbohydrate. So we can create carbohydrates from fat. We can also create carbohydrates from, and specifically sugar. We can also create sugar from protein in a process called gluconeogenesis in the liver. So whenever we cease to eat sugar, the body's the body, in particular, specifically the liver, has us covered in the sense that it can create sugar to pick up the slack to continue to fuel our brains. 60% of our brain's energy needs can come from fat, but there is about a 40% energy requirement for sugar that the brain has.
Okay.
So from a dietary standpoint, it's not essential. From a physiologic standpoint, it is essential.
Okay.
Um,
That's helpful.
yeah. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So protein, essential. Fats, essential. No such thing as an essential carbohydrate. Now, people can obviously survive without carbohydrates, but there is a question of whether or not the inclusion of carbohydrates, and carbs are the term. When I use the term carbohydrates really are a category of nutrients that include fiber, that include complex carbohydrates, and that include simple sugars.
Mm-hmm.
People who perform exercise regularly, which is very important, do better with carbohydrates in the diet, because carbohydrates provide a source of energy for our muscle cells. Our muscle cells store glucose specifically in the form of glycogen, and glycogen is really important to have in your muscle tissue in order to perform high intensity anaerobic work.
Mm-hmm.
So this is one of the reasons why people who are on ketogenic diets, they see a decrement in terms of their performance. They don't perform as well, especially high intensity explosive moves that are much easier for people who are carb loaded.
Mm-hmm.
Also, insulin is an important hormone in the body for anabolic signaling. So for anybody who's really, like, especially in a growth phase, trying to pack on muscle, there's really no good reason to avoid carbohydrates. And in fact, the inclusion of carbohydrates in the diet are optimal. And we see that from bodybuilders. We see that from people who are professional athletes. Carbohydrates are crucially important. When you take those out, performance tends to bonk. There is a rationale to excluding carbohydrates from one's diet if one wants to be on a ketogenic diet. But I think it's important to do that with all of the knowledge that these diets are generally, they are really great for serving a specific therapeutic purpose, for neurological issues, as an example. But they're generally hard to adhere to, and I don't think that chronically being in ketosis makes any more sense from an evolutionary standpoint as being chronically out of ketosis. So, but that's like a sort of side conversation.
Yeah.
The point is that people today overconsume sugar. It's just everywhere. It's in commercial bread products. It's in yogurts. It's in nut milks. It's in sauces. Ketchup is a major source of sugar. We put it in our coffees. We consume sugar sweetened beverages. It's just everywhere. I can't think of a single modern food product that doesn't have some degree of sugar in it. The other day I was at the supermarket and I tried to buy some shredded coconut, and it was sweetened with sugar. Roasted nuts often have sugar added to it. Even salt, iodized salt, has sugar added to it as a means of stabilizing the iodine that they add to iodized salt.
Really?
Yeah, dextrose. So
Okay, that leads me to my next question, because when I'm looking at these labels in the grocery store, it's not going to say in big red letters, this has got sugar in it. So what are some sneaky ways that, like, when we're checking our processed foods, to look for sugar in it? Like dextrose, I don't know if I necessarily would have known that was sugar before we had this conversation.
yeah, generally, any word that has the suffix "ose" is going to be a sugar.
Sugar?
Yeah, so
Okay,
dextrose, glucose, sucrose, fructose. Yeah, those are all sugars.
cool.
And but that being said, also lactose is another example, the dairy sugar. But manufacturers love to hide sugars under bougie sounding names.
Mhm.
So you won't necessarily see glucose or sucrose, but you'll see organic cane sugar or coconut sugar or brown rice syrup. I mean, these are basically just it's a facade to hide the fact that this is added sugar, essentially. And now, thankfully, as of the past, I believe 5 or so years, now manufacturers do have to identify how much added sugar is in a given product.
Yeah.
So if you look on the nutrition facts label, this is very important. You want to make sure that the added sugar is as close to zero as possible. Now, if you are looking through the ingredients list, which I think this is a very good habit for people to get into, and you do see that there's some quantity, there is some that they do list refined cane sugar, for example,
Hmm.
as an ingredient, but then you look and it has 0 grams of added sugar in a serving, then what that implies is that there's really a negligible amount of sugar in that product.
Okay.
Yeah. So it's still better to not consume uh, products with added sugar. I mean, that's the best habit to set for yourself.
Okay.
But if you are going to consume a product, it's helpful to know that you can see the exact gram quantity of added sugar now on the nutrition facts label.
Super
And
helpful.
the closer you can get to zero, the better. Also, keeping in mind that um, how many serving sizes are in a package, and being mindful of how many servings you intend on consuming. That's
Hmm.
all. That's also going to be very helpful.
Okay. So looking at nutrition labels for sneaky ways.
Yeah.
So that also, like, we talked about how sugar is sugar, but then a lot of these like bougie new health brands are coming out with like coconut sugar that are like deeming themselves healthier than cane sugar.
Yeah.
What what are your thoughts on that? Is coconut sugar better than regular sugar?
It's a good question. It's all at the end of the day marketing.
Okay.
Sugar is sugar. Now, certain sugars like agave syrup. Agave syrup is worth highlighting because it's one of the worst offenders in the sense that it really does masquerade as a health food, as a healthier and even diabetic friendly sugar.
Mhm.
And this is because it's primarily fructose. And so it'll promote the fact, usually on the label, that it has that products using agave syrup instead of cane sugar have a lower glycemic index. They have a lower glycemic impact. And that's true, but that's only because it's so low in glucose. And the glycemic index of a product is a measure, it's a metric that measures how rapidly a food is going to elevate your blood sugar, which is really your blood glucose. So a sugar with no glucose in it isn't going to elevate your blood glucose because glucose is the only sugar that can elevate blood glucose. Fructose doesn't elevate blood glucose. Instead, it goes straight to the liver, where the liver stores it, or it gets converted to fat. So that's why um, manufacturers that use agave syrup will claim that, which is true, which is accurate, that agave syrup has a low glycemic index because it's mostly fructose. And this is a problem because most people overconsume carbohydrates. Your average American today consumes about 300 grams of carbohydrates total over the course of the day, which includes the 77 grams of added sugar that they're consuming on a daily basis. And they're sedentary. And the liver has a storage capacity only of about 100 grams of carbohydrates. And this differs person to person based on body size, et cetera. But for the most part, people are walking around in a fed state all day, consuming 300 grams of carbohydrates, not being all that active. We know that leisure time physical activity is at an all-time low. And so in that milieu, is it actually healthier to eat, to consume a sweetener that is mostly fructose? No, because again, it goes straight to the liver. Most of our livers are already full.
Mhm.
They're replete with glycogen. And so what ends up happening is it then stimulates the liver to create fat from that excess of fructose.
Oh,
Yeah.
interesting.
And so that can help drive up triglycerides, which is not good, puts people at increased risk for cardiovascular disease. It can contribute to non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is a major problem here in the United States and increasingly abroad. So it's a big problem. And this is one of the reasons why, as I mentioned, fructose has a low glycemic index. Sucrose, which is table sugar, is about 50% glucose and 50% fructose.
Mm,
The glycemic index of table sugar is somewhere in the middle because, again, it's half fructose, right? And then you have glucose, which has a glycemic index of 100 because it's pure glucose. So
right.
you consume glucose, it spikes your blood sugar because it just goes straight into the blood.
Okay, so that table sugar is really not so great because it's got two kinds of bad,
Well,
not bad, but
yeah, it just
It's affecting your liver and your blood glucose.
Yeah.
Like it's doing both.
Here's the deal. If you're not over consuming calories and you live an active lifestyle, then you can have some sugar in your diet
Mhm.
and you'll be okay. Right. So everybody has a different life, right? Everybody has a different fitness level. Everybody has a different diet. But statistically, most people in the United States are overweight. By the year 2030, 1 in 2 people are going to be not just overweight, but obese in the United States. 50% of people have either type 2 diabetes or prediabetes here in the United States, and prediabetes is often underdiagnosed. And what precedes prediabetes, sometimes by decades, is hyperinsulinemia. So people are eating lots and lots of carbohydrates, and they see their insulin levels chronically elevated. It's like a blood sugar roller coaster all throughout the day. For that person, which again is most people, they really have no business consuming any sugar, right?
Mhm.
Because most Americans are deficient in at least one essential nutrient. About 90% of Americans are deficient in at least one essential nutrient. And so many of us are struggling with problems with our weight and other components of metabolic syndrome, right? 9 in 10 adults now have some component of metabolic syndrome, which is essentially metabolic illness. And so for that person, added sugar, they really should be um, diligent about looking at the foods that they're eating, making sure that they are not consuming or they're at least minimizing their consumption of added sugar. Now, if you live a fit lifestyle and if you are mindful about the foods that you eat, you're not overweight, you don't have your waist size is normal and healthy, you don't carry a lot of visceral fat. Um, do you have is there room in your diet for added sugar? Yeah, probably. And for that person, it doesn't matter so much where the sugar comes from because their livers are always they're chronically in a state of being glycogen depleted
Mhm.
and then being filled up with the whatever whatever fructose they consume, right? And if they're active, whatever glucose they consume is going to glycogenate their muscles, right? As which we
For
discussed
energy.
is important for energy production.
Okay. That's helpful. So we've got added sugar, we've got like the table sugar, like the classic sugar in a cookie. Where else, like you mentioned lactose, and then I do want to go back to talk about fruit a little bit and like fructose and how fruit is kind of a combination of different sugars. But where else are we finding sugar in our diet if it's not in like our pre-packaged foods or cookies and cakes?
Yeah, well, those are the most common
Okay.
occurrences of sugar, and it's also worth noting. I should add that whether or not sugar fits into your personal calorie budget, there are some other problems associated with sugar consumption, especially when we consume a lot of it in one sitting. So there have been studies that have shown that one single high sugar bolus, usually they'll give patients 75 grams of glucose, which is what they'll use in an oral glucose tolerance test. So they
Mhm.
use these 75-gram boluses of glucose for these tests. And they find that um, in one study that just one high sugar beverage was enough to elevate subjects' blood pressure for 2 hours after sugar ingestion. So that was really interesting. We know that having healthy blood pressure is crucially important for
Mhm.
cardiovascular health, for brain health. Now, this was all at one time that the sugar was given. We know that sugar, when you drink a lot of it, it stimulates your sympathetic nervous system, which is your fight or flight response, which is one of the potential mechanisms whereby we saw in this study an increase in blood pressure. I'm not sure if there's a threshold effect or if that sort of consistent consumption of 77 grams of sugar throughout the day is going to have the same net effect on one's blood pressure. But we do know that high sugar diets that are rich in added sugars is associated with hypertension, which is high blood pressure, which is not good for your brain health. It's not good for your cardiovascular health. So we know that independent of calorie intake, that
Right.
sugar can have an acute effect on your blood pressure.
So, sugar's not only raising your blood glucose levels, affecting your liver, it's also increasing your blood pressure, which I feel like is something not talked about. So, is there anything else that consuming large amounts of sugar is causing a problem on that is not just like, oh, my blood sugar's increased that we don't know about or talk about that often?
Yeah, it can lead to a sharp drop in testosterone. So there was another study that found that a similar bolus of sugar, and I believe it used both pure glucose and sucrose, which is, sucrose is actually more representative of the kind of sugar that we consume on a daily basis. Even high fructose corn syrup molecularly looks a lot like sucrose. Both are about 50% uh, glucose, 50% fructose.
Okay.
So in this study, they found, and we can put in the show notes citations just in case people want to read the studies. Um, Found that subjects after a high sugar bolus had a 25% drop in their testosterone, which sustained again for 2 hours afterwards. So,
Wow.
testosterone is really important for well being. It's super important for body composition. It's important for libido, for sexual performance. It's important for so many things for both men and women. I mean,
Yeah.
women also have testosterone,
I was just
about
gonna
a
say that.
tenth as much as men, but um, crucially important to know. I mean, and I think it's not. It's not uncommon these days for men to be presenting with low testosterone. I mean, a lot personally, anecdotally, a lot of my friends that have gotten blood work recently, they're seeing lower than expected levels of testosterone,
Wow.
which I think is a major problem. And I think it's due to our. I mean, there are many factors I think that influence this. I think it's the fact that our diets are abundant with rapidly digesting carbohydrates from processed grain products and the like. It's our exposure to endocrine disrupting compounds, environmental toxicants, and things like that. But I don't think there's a question that sugar plays a role, especially at the levels at the concentration that your average American is consuming sugar at today.
Interesting. Yeah, I'd never really associated low testosterone with excessive sugar intake.
Yeah,
Wow. What
yeah,
else? What else?
yeah.
I feel like there's
There's a link. Well,
yeah.
I guess finally, the other aspect, the other thing that sugar could do to our health that isn't quite productive to health is it can mess up our teeth and it can screw with our oral microbiome, which is uh, no bueno. And this again is independent of whether or not sugar fits into your personal calorie budget. So I think a lot of the time when we talk about sugar, we talk about it in the context of calories, and calories do matter. And sugar, you may or may not have a budget for a certain level of added sugar consumption in your diet. I aim for as close to 0 grams of added sugar as possible, with the exception of foods where I think the benefits outweigh the risks, like with dark chocolate. There's always going to be a little bit of added sugar in dark chocolate,
Mm-hmm.
but I try to keep that number as close to 0 as possible. And one of the other reasons why I think it's worth doing that is that added sugar can feed bacteria in your mouth, Streptococcus mutans in particular, that promote cavity formation and also bad breath. So getting the sugar out of your diet really important for dental health, for oral health. We know that oral health plays a role in systemic health at this point. What's good for the mouth and the oral microbiome is good for the rest of the body. Teeth are crucially important for the survival of an animal, right? If you think about it from an evolutionary standpoint, teeth are the way that an animal fights off enemies like predators, right? It's how an animal procures food, um, and it's how an animal chews food, right? Like it's not just how an animal catches
Right.
its prey potentially, or in the case of herbivores, how it procures whatever it is that it wants to eat, but it's how you break down.
Digest.
You start. That's where digestion occurs, right, with the chewing of food. And so in the wild, an animal without teeth is quickly a dead animal. And so I think we really have to start to look at what's good for our systemic health through the lens of the oral microbiome and dental health. And sugar is interesting in the sense that sugar sweetened beverages, which are a major problem globally. Actually, there was a mathematical modeling that they did published in the journal Circulation that found that 183,000 deaths worldwide are attributable to sugar sweetened beverages alone.
Wait, can you repeat that? That
So
just feels like a lot, but I want to make sure.
almost 200,000 people. So this was like this was a study where they use these complex mathematical modeling, goes over my head, but they essentially estimated that because of the excess of non-satiating calories that people consume when they consume sugar sweetened beverages like sodas, fruit juices, um, coffee drinks, from Starbucks that have
Yeah.
60 sometimes grams of sugar in a single beverage, that these beverages alone are responsible for up to 200, almost 200,000 deaths worldwide annually.
Wow.
Because we know that the kinds of conditions that now kill most people, right? According to the World Health Organization, 60% of deaths are attributable to non communicable chronic diseases that are, for the most part, diet and lifestyle driven.
Hmm.
That the role that sugar sweetened beverages play in in the global disease, in the global non communicable disease burden is so vast that you could basically like chalk up almost 200,000 deaths to sugar sweetened beverages alone.
That's wild.
Yeah. Yeah.
Wow.
Yeah. And it's not that one beverage here or there
Do that.
is going to take you out, right?
No.
But it's just, if you think about how many calories people are consuming from these beverages that provide no nutritional value, no satiety benefit, and are just going to, they're fattening up our livers, they're driving our blood sugar through the roof. It's just a major problem. But the
Yeah.
one aspect of these drinks that interestingly doesn't seem to be all that negative is the impact that they have on our teeth. So we were always, I think, growing up, we were warned by our grandparents not to drink too much soda, right?
Yeah.
Because it'll destroy your teeth. Well, actually, the worst offenders when it comes to dental health are grain products and in particular grain products that are sweetened with added sugar, because they get retained between your teeth much more easily than a sugar sweetened beverage, which once you drink, you basically, it's in your mouth for a fraction of a second before you swallow it. And it's just not enough time for your oral bacteria to grab onto the sugar molecules, right? But cookies, cake, donuts, commercial breads, most of
Mhm.
which that have added, high fructose corn syrup in it, very easily retained by oral bacteria, especially Streptococcus mutans, which are the bacteria uh, most responsible for the formation of dental caries. And so those are, yeah, it's a big problem. It's a
Yeah.
big problem.
That makes total sense though, because I'm just thinking back to like camp days of having like a white bread, peanut butter and jelly, and that white bread just like sticking inside your teeth and the roof of your mouth.
Yeah.
So that makes sense. I mean, but that's just so sneaky. Who would have thought, oh, I got a cavity from white bread?
I mean, anecdotally, when I was a kid, I used to eat tons of donuts, of bakery products, cookies, cakes, uh, wheat based snacks,
Yeah.
you name it. And every time I would go to the dentist, I would always have a new cavity.
Interesting.
Yeah, it was a big problem. I must have had like 7 or 8 or 9 cavities at some point.
Ooh,
Maybe not that much.
that's a
well,
lot.
I know that as a kid, every time I would go to the dentist, which was like once a year, my mom was
Yeah.
on it in terms of my dental health. She would bring me, or maybe it's every 6 months.
It's
You're
every
supposed to get
6
every
months.
6 months. You're supposed
Yeah.
to get a cleaning. Every time I would go, for the most part, I would have a new cavity.
Wow.
Yeah, it was a big bummer.
Yeah. That
But
is a big, big bummer.
but I didn't know, especially because my mom and my family, we primarily bought products that were lower in fat, lower in cholesterol. They tended to have the big red heart healthy
Yep.
logo on them. So you think that those are going to be good for you, right? But those are some of the worst products in the supermarket with regard to your dental health.
Dental and sneaky sugar, because that was like the whole war on fat,
Yeah,
where like they decided to make everything low in fat and then up the sugar intake so it tasted good still.
absolutely.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay. So blood pressure, testosterone,
Or dental
dental
health.
health.
You cut out sugar, you will added sugar in particular, you're going to see benefits to your hunger mechanisms. So you're going to feel more satiated because you're going to be eating more whole food, right?
Yeah.
You're going to see benefit to your waistline, most likely. You're going to have a greater awareness of what it is that you're putting into your mouth, which I think is really important.
Mhm.
Mindfulness about your food consumption, an improvement in hormone production, an improvement in your blood pressure, an improvement potentially in your dental health.
Okay.
Yeah, these are all
It's
really
huge.
important, great things. Yeah.
Yeah. So I feel like that's reasoning enough to,
And energy levels. We forgot even to
oh,
mention that.
yeah.
Yeah.
Let's talk about that. Love that. Let's talk about sugar and energy.
Well, so here's the thing: is our bodies are used to our bodies have been honed by millennia, right? Of struggle when it came to food scarcity, and now thankfully we have food security, and that paved the way for the industrial revolution, which has allowed for for food processing really to um, become the double-edged sword that it is today. We have innumerable ultra-processed food products. Sugar has become cheap enough for your average person to afford it, whereas in antiquity it used to be a luxury, right? Sugar was something that was like given as a gift, actually. Today, sugar is cheap,
Mhm.
especially because of government subsidies. We can now make sugar from corn. Um, it's it's everywhere, and and so yeah, so the body is not very good at handling sugar that is so rapidly digested. It's just a big problem. Most of the time for a hunter gatherer, where sugar would appear in the diet would be in the form of whole fruit, which for the most part wasn't very sweet. I mean, people can go and Google. I've done an Instagram post about this actually in the past where I've shown the difference between modern cultivated bananas and wild bananas, or what a modern watermelon looks like in comparison to what we think
Mhm.
the ancestral watermelon looked
Yeah.
like based on you can find paintings um, that have like the OG watermelon in it, and it's a dramatic contrast to what it currently looks like today. Apples, for example, I mean, crab apples weren't even that sweet; they were bitter. And today we have Honeycrisp apples, which I love. Right?
Yeah.
We
Yeah,
both,
we do.
yeah,
Yeah.
we definitely do. But I find them when they're in season the size of like my head.
Oh, they're
They're
huge.
huge. I'm being
Yeah.
hyperbolic, but like they're very large and they're very sweet and we love them, um but the body is like it's at least it's good at digesting sugar when it is contained in a whole food matrix like whole fruit, right? You've got
Mhm.
fiber, you've got water to slow the digestion of sugar. But today, whether it's via the consumption of refined grains, which begins to break down into its constituent sugar molecules as soon as you start chewing on whatever it
Mhm.
is that you're eating, right? Like a rice cake or a wheat snack. You're the salivary amylase, which is an enzyme that breaks down polysaccharides into disaccharides, which then it's so rapid um, that you absorb the carbohydrates as glucose straight at like very soon after digestion, at the very top of the small intestine, the
Mhm.
duodenum. And this occurs with refined grain products, but it definitely occurs with sugar sweetened beverages and fruit juice. With fruit juice, you're basically pre digesting fruit, you're extracting all the sugar, and what you're getting this straight hit of sugar straight into the bloodstream that the body doesn't really know how to deal with. And
Mhm.
it's a major reason why I think we're dealing with fatigue and uh, and just chronic hunger throughout the day. It's because we're perennially on this blood sugar roller coaster. There was a really interesting study that used wheat porridge, two kinds of wheat porridge. They were controlled for carbohydrate content and the two porridges, and it was controlled for calories, which makes sense if they were controlled for if they controlled for carbohydrate content. But the difference between the two porridges were that one was coarsely ground and one was finely ground to replicate the difference between a more minimally processed
Okay.
carbohydrate source and an ultra processed
Okay.
carbohydrate source. And what they found in that study when they gave it to subjects in this crossover trial was that the more finely ground porridge, like the wheat porridge that underwent more intensive processing
Mhm.
because it was so easily digested by the body, it sent the blood sugar higher. It led to a greater secretion of insulin um, after consumption in the or even during consumption in the absorptive phase. And I think what's most interesting was that it sent the subject's blood sugar below baseline after they had consumed the more finely ground porridge
Interesting.
compared to the more coarsely ground porridge, which the blood sugar elevated, insulin went up, obviously, which makes sense because
Mhm.
whenever blood sugar goes up, you see a rise in insulin. But then it was like a plane landing on a runway. Like it came right back down to baseline.
Wow.
Whereas the more finely ground porridge went to it spiked up higher and then it went below baseline, which is which for those subjects could very well signal hunger. For people prone to anxiety, it could signal anxiety. We've had a number of nutritionally minded psychiatrists on the podcast who've talked about the fact that rapidly digested carbohydrates, when you consume them, it can trigger reactive hypoglycemia, which can then trigger episodes of anxiety. Right.
Mhm.
So that sensation that people tend to be familiar with these days, hunger,
Mhm.
it's a big problem. And that was all influenced by the mere processing of the food alone. So, all that is to say that pure sugar is not something that our bodies are very efficient at coping with.
Right. And then it will put you in the red,
Yeah,
which can cause
puts you in the
anxiety.
red. Nobody
Yeah.
wants that. Yeah.
No.
So, I mean, a lot of people talk about slow carbs, slower digesting
Yeah.
carbohydrates. That's where, if integrating, if you choose to eat carbs, which is fine, by all means
Mhm.
do it. You want to generally reach for carbohydrates that are slower digesting and from whole food
Well,
sources.
yeah.
Yeah.
We've talked about that a lot, especially in relation to juices and even like fruit juices or, vegetable juices that have an apple in them because it is that fast sugar and it's not accompanied by the chewing or the fiber.
Yeah.
So it's when you consume just that sugar straight.
Yeah. Some of my
Okay.
favorite carbohydrate sources. I mean, I love tubers, sweet potatoes, even white potatoes are nutrient dense, right? They're loaded
Yeah.
with potassium. Beets are one of my favorite sources of carbohydrates because,
Love beets.
yeah, you get those nitrates, which are really great for fueling your nitric oxide pathway, which is important for maintaining healthy blood pressure, healthy blood
Mhm.
flow to your organs. Um, so great. Carrots, I'm a huge fan of fruit, whole fruit, love whole fruit. Uh,
Okay.
yeah, those are all
Yeah.
great carbohydrate sources.
So for someone who's wanting to potentially cut out sugar, feels inspired to, um, can we talk about how to do that and maybe like the different ways to do it? Like, say, if you're mostly sedentary, like you mentioned, you need to cut out, you should cut out a large portion. And then can we talk about like some people that are like active and how they should cut out sugar?
Yeah.
Can we do both? Please and
Well,
thank you.
please and thank you. Well, when it comes to cutting out sugar, I think it can be useful to go cold turkey. I mean,
Okay.
and 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 I think that that's where um, alternative sweetening products can play a role. I
Mm,
think in the wellness world, there are a lot of like people who promote this idea of perfectionism. Like you can't consume any artificial sweeteners and things like that. Now, I personally don't consume any artificial sweeteners. I like stevia, monk fruit, and erythritol. That's kind of what I use to sweeten, whatever it is that I'm reaching for. But for people who are really sugar addicts, um, whatever you need to do to get your non-caloric sweet fix, I think go for it. I think
okay.
if that's going to be helpful to you. Um, my general, my, what I when I'm craving something sweet, again, I like to go for more natural, non-caloric sweeteners. Um, as I mentioned, stevia, which is made from just a root that's ground, and it provides a sweet taste with um, no calorie contribution. Erythritol is great. It's a sugar alcohol. It's not prone to upsetting people's stomachs the way that other sugar alcohols
Mhm.
do. So if you've ever had a product sweetened with lots of sugar alcohols and you've had an upset stomach, um, erythritol is very well tolerated typically. Um, so so I would consider giving that a shot.
Okay.
Yeah. Um, but yeah, I mean, I think reaching for more natural products that are less processed, looking at the ingredients lists, looking at the nutritional facts label, making sure that there is no added sugar. Um, you also, once you start to reduce the amount of added sugar in your diet, you'll crave it less. Also,
Okay.
so
Interesting. So, what I think it's, you start by cutting out maybe the sugar sweetened beverages and then things like that. But what about like an after dinner, after lunch sweet tooth? How
yeah,
help?
Health. um, well, I think that's where getting better at moderating your sugar consumption throughout the day can be helpful, because then when you do choose to indulge after dinner,
Mhm.
which we all do occasionally,
For sure.
right? Um, it's an indulgence. Treat it like like an earned indulgence.
Okay.
Yeah. Or maybe not even an earned indulgence, because I feel
Yeah.
like that can compromise people's relationship with food.
Yeah.
Here's the thing. Not
Tell me.
everybody's different, and not every message is for you, right? I sometimes like to think about my sugar consumption as being an earned indulgence, right?
Yeah.
But I have a very healthy relationship with food.
Yeah.
Not everybody does.
Right.
So if that's going to be problematic for you, don't think about it as that. Instead, think
Yeah.
about it as a planned indulgence. Think about it like, you know, you are going to your favorite restaurant, and by all means, if they have a dessert on the menu that you love, you're going to go for it. That's
Yeah.
okay. No shame. All
No.
good.
Yeah.
No shame, no consequence.
No.
Actually, there are studies that show that when we consume um, sugar in the post meal setting, after we've gotten our
Mhm.
protein and fats out of the way, there's a reduced blood sugar impact.
Spike.
Yeah, as
Oh,
opposed to if you were to
interesting.
eat it before.
So all
So,
those people who eat dessert before dinner,
not many people.
there's a lot of them.
Are there?
I don't
Uh,
know.
well, it's a rationale to avoid the bread basket, right? To
Oh,
not eat to skip the bread
the
when it
bread.
comes and instead have dessert, right?
I'm down for that.
There are also some other really great ways of um, helping better manage your blood sugar
Okay.
that allow you to have your cake and eat it too, so to speak. But including some kind of vinegar cocktail at dinner. Vinegar is well known for its anti-diabetic effects, its
Okay.
anti-hyperglycemic effects specifically. We actually in
I
Genius
was
Kitchen,
going, that was beautiful.
yeah,
Well done.
we have a great recipe in the book for a vinegar-based mocktail called the Vinny Gambini.
Yeah.
After what movie? We named it after uh,
Is it my uncle?
my uncle,
My cousin
my
Vinny.
cousin Vinny.
Jeez.
Yeah, good movie though. I
Yeah.
mean, I had such a crush on Marissa Tomei after
Yeah.
that movie.
She's still great.
She's still great,
Yeah.
but we have a really delicious vinegar based mocktail in here that soothes the stomach, improves blood sugar responses.
Okay. So
Um,
we should drink that with dinner before
Drink it with dinner. Also helps digestion because vinegar is an
dessert.
acid,
Hmm.
and it helps. Yeah, it helps
Interesting.
reduce the blood sugar impact of a meal with starch in it.
Okay. So that's
Yeah.
even kind of fun if like you're making a salad with salad dressing.
It doesn't
And
actually, here's the interesting thing about vinegar
uh-oh.
is it doesn't, if you were to consume pure glucose, vinegar would not have an effect on mitigating the blood sugar spike.
Okay.
What it does is it interferes with the enzymes that break down disaccharides. So if you were going to consume a starch, for example,
So
that's where vinegar really would help lower the blood sugar impact.
okay, so if you're gonna have, ooh, I love this
Like a
meal.
bowl of pasta or
I
something.
was gonna say like a potato. Like you have a steak potato and then your salad, you make sure it's got vinegar on it.
Perfect application for the Vinny Gambini.
Yeah.
Yeah, to come in and help your body better cope with the blood sugar
Wow.
onslaught. Yeah. Cinnamon is
Okay.
another one of these great
Mm.
great compounds. Ceylon cinnamon in particular is very effective in terms of its anti-hyperglycemic effects.
Wait, can I ask a question? Because
Yeah.
this just came up. But yesterday I had that Greek yogurt and I put cinnamon in it. Was that just for
Great.
taste or was
Yeah.
that logical?
Both. No, I mean I love the taste of cinnamon, but
So
it
do I.
also
It was purely taste.
yeah. But cinnamon has a number of really cool phytochemicals in it, but it's well known for its its ability to help you better manage your blood sugar. Also, just taking a walk after dinner,
Mhm.
just a small walk around the block
10, 15
can do
minutes.
wonders for your blood sugar. Super super
Okay.
important. Yeah.
Yeah, that recipe in there is
We got tons of
dope.
in the cookbook. We've got tons of amazing low sugar desserts,
Mhm.
uh, and the whole book is generally very low in sugar. It's grain
Yeah.
free, gluten free, mostly dairy free. Genius Kitchen, available wherever you get your books. But you can pre-order now at geniuskitchenbook.com.
Yeah.
Geniuskitchenbook.com.
Yeah. That was a beautiful, subtle plug, but I don't want to like giggle it away because it is a fantastic book that you should be really proud of.
Yeah,
And
it's not just a cookbook. It's a wellness
yeah.
guide. It's a nutrition
Hmm.
resource.
Yeah. And
So
this,
I'm a little self-conscious that I'm on the cover, but I'll get over
oh,
it.
yeah.
You
The
know?
cover's great.
Yeah.
It's beautiful. Yeah.
Glad
The
you like it.
contents on the inside are even better.
Um,
Okay. Can I ask another question it's related to sugar?
yeah.
But just out of curiosity, your birthday's coming up. What type of birthday cake? Do you do birthday cake? Are you
Oh man. I typically when I do a cake or treat, I do look for like keto products. I'm
okay?
not on a ketogenic diet,
Okay.
but you know, I eat lots of whole fruit. And I'll have the occasional sweet potato and I eat brown rice with my sushi. But
Yep.
when I'm reaching for desserts, I look for keto products because they tend to use higher quality ingredients. So you tend not to see grain and seed oils
Okay.
utilized in keto products. They tend to be sugar free. Although I look closely to make sure that they don't use artificial sweeteners.
Hmm.
Um, I think the jury's still out on synthetic man-made artificial sweeteners. There's really not good data to say that they're unhealthy, but my personal choice is to reach for more natural. So you know, I'll look for keto products that are sweetened with monk fruit, stevia, erythritol, allulose.
Okay.
We talk about all the different sweeteners also
Hmm.
in Genius Kitchen. But yeah, I'll look for like a grain-free product, you know, that's made with like an almond flour or a coconut flour. Also, because I think that increases the nutrient density
Right. Which then is going
of
to
the food.
better help your body not get in the red
Yeah.
if it's more nutrient dense.
Well, it's more nutrient dense, and I just think
Insulin in the red.
nutrient density is important.
Okay.
Um, Almonds and coconut flour also have a prebiotic effect. Um, in terms of like helping support gut health and feeding the trillions of microbes that live in the large intestine. It's just a better option. It's just a better, more nutritious option. And I still feel like I'm indulging. I still
Yeah. It
those
still tastes
you know,
good.
you can keto cakes now are amazing.
Yeah.
We've talked about, or we've had Crosby Taylor on the podcast who,
Yes. I still think about that yellow cake you made.
I mean, yeah, he's like a
It's good.
master
Yeah.
and we also have like, I mean, not to just like completely make this about the cookbook, but we've got sugar-free cake recipes in
Yeah.
the book, in the back of the book. So there are ways uh, to indulge and do it in a way that keeps your overall sugar burden low.
Okay.
It takes a little bit of know-how.
You didn't really answer my question though. What type of cake?
Love red velvet.
Okay.
Love.
I didn't really see that coming.
Huh. I mean,
Feels a little.
I'm not into anything with fruit. It's gonna be vanilla or cinnamon or chocolate or like,
And it's going to be like a cake.
yeah.
Yeah.
Or like I'm into donuts. Halva. Have you ever had halva? It's like a
No.
Middle Eastern thing. So good.
Halva.
Very calorie dense, but so
Oh,
good. So
okay.
freaking good. Yeah.
Okay. All right.
Really tasty.
Okay, that's helpful. I
Yeah.
was just curious.
We actually got this cool product called Lumen that we should talk about.
Yeah, let's do it. I see it sitting there.
Yeah. So Lumen is a device that was founded by two PhDs, two physiology PhDs. And the goal of the device is to help you determine what fuel substrate your body is using more of, fat or carbs. So you blow into this device and it lets you know whether you are burning more fat or carbohydrates. And this is pretty cool because to determine that in the past, you would have required a metabolic cart, which is this big fancy
Yeah,
machine, right?
they're cool.
Got multiple monitors on it,
Yeah.
hooks you up to a face mask. It's very expensive. It's very arduous. It's uncomfortable. And what that machine does is it determines what's called your respiratory exchange ratio and does that very well. But they've actually published, Lumen has published a peer-reviewed study that found that this correlates very closely, at least in young, healthy people during a resting condition. So when at rest,
Okay.
that this is actually quite accurate when it comes to determining what fuel substrate your body is using more of, carbs or fat.
So you're using that in a resting state.
Right. Use this in a resting state, and it tells
to
you basically what it does. So at rest, oxygen use is fairly stable.
Mhm.
But what changes based on whether or not you're metabolizing mostly fat or mostly carbohydrates to create energy is the amount of carbon dioxide that you exhale. So the respiratory exchange ratio is the ratio between carbon dioxide produced and oxygen utilized. Um,
Okay.
and the higher that number is, the more carbohydrates you're burning. And the lower that number is, the more fat
That
you're
you're
burning.
using.
Yeah. Because carbohydrate use yields more carbon dioxide. It's actually really interesting
Mhm.
why that occurs. It's like when you're doing high intensity anaerobic exercise and you cease to be able to get enough oxygen to fuel that work, you go into anaerobic mode, which is
Mhm.
oxygen free, right?
Yeah.
And so that's the exact kind of exercise that you rely on stored glycogen for,
To you. Okay, yeah.
right? It's
Mhm.
oxygen free, and you're utilizing basically stored glucose to generate energy. It's a very short lived energy substrate. It's also not very metabolically efficient for most people because you generate lactic acid as a byproduct. Um, so especially in certain contexts, you want to be like being more of a fat burner is going to be more metabolically a more metabolically favorable condition, particularly in the context of just waking up
Mm.
because you've undergone a 8 to 10 hour fast, right?
Yeah.
Mostly throughout the day, you're going to be burning carbohydrates because you're in a fed state for the most part. You'll have
Mhm.
consumed some carbs. Carbohydrates, when you eat carbohydrates, also you spike insulin, and insulin basically mandates that you're burning carbohydrates.
Yeah.
Um, so it's pretty cool. So we got this device, Lumen. Uh, I want to actually like try it, use it, see what I'm burning right now. I'm going to bet that I'm burning
Yeah.
mostly carbohydrates right now, just because I'm in the fed state. But if I were to do this in the morning, it would probably be
Fat.
I would probably be mostly burning fat.
Okay.
Um,
So wait, how does it work? It
so I've got this device. If you're just listening to this, it looks kind of like a vape.
that's what I thought. I was like, what is
It
he
looks
up
like a
to?
vape, yeah. But it's really this. It's like a cool, like Darth Vader esque black
It is
thing.
sleek.
It is very sleek. And what you do is you blow into it, and it measures the amount of carbon dioxide
Uh-huh.
that you release in your breath. And again, using that, it determines your respiratory energy.
Carbs.
Yeah, your respiratory exchange
Fats.
ratio. Um, and it syncs with an app on your phone,
Okay.
and this way you can track trends and the like. So I'm gonna
Okay. I
turn
have
it turn it on right now.
oh, there it is.
It's on.
Device pairing.
Yeah, it's so cool technology. And by the way, I think people, when you're burning fat, so burning fat is you want to be a good fat burner. This doesn't really tell you whether or not you are priming the pump for weight loss because that's about calories at the end of the day.
Okay.
Calories in, calories out. But this does, I think, tell you a little bit about your metabolic flexibility, your overall metabolic health. And there
Okay.
have been studies that have linked more carbohydrate burning with a predisposition for weight gain,
Oh.
which is correlational. But I think it can tell you something about because if you have hyperinsulinemia, for example, if your insulin levels are chronically elevated, you're going to be burning primarily carbohydrates. You're not going to be a very good fat burner. So particularly in the fasted state, you want your body to be able to tap into your fat stores,
Yes.
and that's what this can help, I believe,
Okay.
tell you.
So you're not really supposed to use it in the middle of the day. It works best if you use it in the morning.
You can use it in the middle of the day. You can use it in the middle of the day. You can use it in the morning. I think that a ketogenic dieter will probably
Oh,
find utility in seeing whether or not they're burning fat or carbs mostly
yeah,
by using
throughout
this in
the
the middle of the
day.
day. But I think it's probably its best use case, especially for somebody who has a mixed diet.
Yeah.
Um, Probably going to be in the morning setting, and you can use this to track every morning to see.
Yeah, that's what I'm
You can iterate
it's
with your
cool.
diet and then see.
And then you can get like a plot graph.
Yeah, it's super cool.
Does it tell you levels or just?
It doesn't give you. It has a proprietary algorithm. I would like it if they. I would prefer it if they would just give you the data.
Yeah.
But they did publish. This is actually one of the reasons why I agreed to test it out. They did publish a peer review paper that found that it was correlated with the metabolic cart findings.
Yeah.
In
Love that.
in a bunch of subjects. Yeah. So.
Okay. Cool.
Yeah.
Let's do it.
All right. So first, you have to. It's telling me what to do.
Talking to you.
Inhale deeply. Okay.
She's got a cute accent.
Holding my breath. All right. So I think it's going to probably ask me to do it again just to make sure that it's accurate. Okay, yeah. So I got to wait 13 seconds and then I'm going to do one more breath. And again, my hypothesis, I'm burning probably mostly carbs at this point because I'm fed. I'm in a fed state. Let's do one more breath. Ready?
I'm just sitting here. I'll just narrate. You're doing great. He's got 7 seconds left, guys.
Woo! All right. Let's see where we're at. Thanks, Lumen. I'm right in the middle. I'm burning both carbs and fat. So that's a good sign. I'm in a fed state and I'm still burning fat.
Nice.
Yeah.
How proud are you of that?
I was expecting it to be a little bit higher in the carb usage, but I guess I've had a pretty low carbohydrate day. When you eat mostly carbs, you're going to burn mostly carbs. When you eat mostly fat, you're going to oxidize mostly fat. So that's kind of how it works.
What have you eaten today? Just like
today I had some leftovers actually. I had
probably like ground meat for breakfast.
Yeah, I had these grass-fed meatballs that I had made that were really, really tasty the other night. And so I reheated them. I ate them on a grain-free bun. So I made like a meatball sandwich.
You had a meatball sub.
Yeah. And I also had I had a sumo orange.
Oh,
which has about 30 grams of 35 grams of
being a little high in sugar.
Of sugar, yeah.
Okay, so interesting.
But in total, yeah. So in total, I think that was probably my only major carbohydrate source all day, and it's about 4:30 in the afternoon.
That's impressive.
Yeah, yeah. So I've only had about like maybe 40 grams of carbohydrates all day, and I worked out earlier in the morning. So actually, I'm probably this actually makes sense.
Yeah.
Thanks, Lumen.
It actually makes sense.
Yeah. You guys can check out Lumen if you're interested in learning more about the device at lumen.me. They it's a really cool device.
Yeah.
And they sent this to us free to use. And gotta say, I am impressed with the technology. So thanks, Lumen.
Yeah.
Lumen.me. Well, I think that about wraps up Sugar. Hey guys, if you enjoyed that conversation, you're going to love this one.
Fructose, when it's metabolized, becomes uric acid and tells the body winter is coming, make fat. So this is powerful new information, a tool in our toolbox that we never had before. We've known since 1970 in the Lancet that fructose is messing us up in terms of our metabolism, but we never understood exactly how that happens. What are the mechanisms? And now that researchers like Dr. Richard Johnson at University of Colorado have identified this role of uric acid and why we as humans have as much as 4 times as much uric acid as other mammals, because it was a survival mechanism, it makes us realize that context is everything. In the context of food scarcity, hey, great that we have this mutation that causes us to have higher uric acid. But in the context of so much sugar and fructose specifically in our lives, it's killing us. And it allows us a new tool. Keeping uric acid levels in check allows us to rein in the fat production, inflammation, free radical mediated stress, increased blood sugar, insulin resistance, all the components of what we call the metabolic syndrome, which underlie just about every chronic disease condition that we don't want to get.
Yeah, you've always been ahead of the curve. It was a decade now at this point almost that you blew the whistle on refined grains, and specifically what refined grains can do to the health of our brains. And you were very much ahead of the curve on that. And what gluten can do in the context of our GI tract and how that can cause a cascade that can influence brain health potentially. So why now uric acid?
Well, I think my mission has been to do my very best to give people information about how they can optimize their metabolism. Because again, these metabolic derangements that are so pervasive, 88% of American adults have at least one component of the metabolic syndrome. That means only 1 in 8 American adults is metabolically intact. 50% of American adults, that's the number by 2030. And 2030 is not in the distant future. That's just around the corner. So that, 1/3 of Americans is obese. 74% of American adults right now is obese or at least overweight. And, the reason for me to put out a book like Drop Acid is to be a doctor. The term doctor means teacher. It doesn't mean healer. It means teacher. It means giving information so then people who avail themselves of that information can make the changes to regain health and help stave off disease. And, dare I need you tell you that these neurodegenerative conditions are challenging. You have been there, and I have been there in terms of having a parent. And I've certainly, with 35 years of clinical practice dealing with things like Alzheimer's, have been seeking out what we can do to let the world know that there are things that can happen, choices we can make to reduce our risk of these devastating issues, for which we have no meaningful treatment, I might add, despite the release of drugs that target this beta amyloid. We saw how that recently played out. It didn't. So the mission is to be preventive on the front end and really keep people cognitively healthy with respect to all aspects of their metabolism. Turns out that uric acid is yet another tool. We published Grain Brain, as you say, almost a decade ago, 2013. And at that point, the data was becoming very clear that people had a dramatic increased risk of Alzheimer's if their blood sugar was even slightly elevated at 105, published in the New England Journal of Medicine, knowing that becoming a type 2 diabetic can as much as quadruple a person's risk for Alzheimer's, an untreatable disease, made me really want to concentrate on getting this word out that, folks, you need to get your blood sugar in check. That's job one. Yeah, we want to keep our waistlines reduced. We want to manage our blood pressure as well. Definitely want to exercise to increase the growth of new brain cells, all the things. But I think the biggest issue are the metabolic problems that are so rampant in our society that represent a mismatch between our evolution and our environment. That evolutionarily, these things that change in our metabolism, the increased body fat, the increased blood sugar, the increased blood pressure, were powerful survival tools. That's why it was selected out 14 million years ago for us, our ancestors, and then Paleolithic ancestors, to have higher uric acid levels, because it allowed them to survive during times of food and water scarcity. And now, of course, we see this huge mismatch because we don't need the activation of those pathways to make fat, to tell our bodies to prepare for the winter that never comes, because, we're consuming fructose, the powerful inroad to this whole cascade, 365 days a year. When you see 60 to 70% of the labeled foods in grocery stores having added sweeteners, and by and large, those are either pure fructose or high fructose corn syrup derivatives, it's no mystery. Now that we understand how fructose does its dirty work through uric acid, it's no mystery that health is in general just going down the tubes.
It really is. So, uric acid, the subject of your new book, Drop Acid, it's going to be probably a new term for many people listening. You mentioned that as a physician, you were taught about it mostly in the context of the disease state gout. But what do we currently know about uric acid, its role in the body? And then I want to get into, the diet and lifestyle factors that are able to modulate levels of uric acid in the body.
So uric acid, let's take a step back, is a danger signal. It's alerting our body, it's sounding an alarm saying we better start making fat because winter's coming and food scarcity is going to be an issue, and water scarcity as well. And I definitely want to get into the water scarcity part because that relates to how uric acid increases blood pressure. So what triggers uric acid are things that perhaps would be seasonal. For example, that would come before the winter, before we'd be slogging through the snow looking to find a tuber or a dead animal or who knows what. And what happens in the late summer and in the early fall? Fruit ripens. And our ancestors and primate ancestors as well would eat fruit because it was sweet. And that's the reason that everybody on the planet, you and me included, have a sweet tooth. People say, oh, I don't have a sweet tooth. Or it's one thing to say, I choose not to eat sweets. That's not talking about your deepest drive to eat sugar. That comes from a more primordial part of your brain that is, fundamental for survival. You can choose not to eat sweet. That's having your more advanced prefrontal cortex be the adult in the room, say, yeah, you can eat cupcakes all day, but that's not our choice because we want to live a long and healthy life. So in the context then of our ancestors, this danger signal, uric acid, the downstream manifestation of the metabolism of fructose, and also purines, which come from meat, for example, organ meats, and also from alcohol. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. It's not all alcohol that is threatening. This is a signal that plays upon our metabolism to, in the liver, increase what is called gluconeogenesis. Gluconeogenesis, the new production of sugar. Why? Because sugar powers the brain, and that's our high card. That is how we avoid two things, starvation and predation. So we can find food because we're clever enough to know how to get food, and don't get eaten by another animal. That's, at least historically, why we would need to make glucose from the other components in our bodies, amino acids, breaking down protein, to power the brain to allow us to get out of trouble. We're not the strongest, we're not the fastest animal in the forest, but maybe we're the smartest, who knows? So in that context, then, we recognize that what uric acid is doing is fanning the flames of this increased sugar production and also increasing our body's retention of water, ultimately, so that we can avoid being dehydrated. And as such, it does raise blood pressure, which would have been a good thing in the day. Nowadays, not so much, as they say. So that's what uric acid does. These powerful mechanisms within the liver and elsewhere in the body that really deeply affect our metabolism. What uric acid does, along with the metabolism of fructose, a little bit technical here, but we have two ways of metabolizing something called AMP. And what AMP is the downstream end product of our energy consumption. Our energy is stored as ATP. When ATP loses a phosphate group, it becomes ADP, adenosine diphosphate. ATP has 3, ADP has 2, down to AMP, adenosine monophosphate, that's just 1. Every loss of this phosphate, when it breaks apart from the adenosine backbone, releases energy to how we power our bodies. Interestingly, fundamentally, the metabolism of fructose consumes ATP down to AMP. That's so different from how we metabolize glucose, for example. And as such, it's an energy lowering process, but it's also important because that, along with uric acid, shifts our metabolism from, there are two pathways. And here's the nerdy part for all the nerds who are watching right now.
We love it.
We have two major pathways in the body. One is when we're out doing stuff, using energy, tapping into our fat resources, keeping our blood sugar normal. That is brought about by activating something called AMPK. On the other hand, AMP can be metabolized through a totally different pathway called AMP deaminase. When we activate AMP deaminase, that's telling our bodies that we either need to get ready for winter or we're going to hibernate. If you're a bear getting ready to hibernate, you're packing in the fructose, eating the berries, your AMP deaminase is on fire. You are making fat, you are storing fat, and your metabolic rate is reduced. So you're not burning calories. Well, obviously, we want to keep AMP kinase activated because AMP kinase says, hey, we're going to burn fat, we're not going to store fat, and we're sure as heck not going to make more blood sugar because we just don't need it. Everything is fine. Uric acid shuts that off. And that is fundamental. Uric acid
prepares your body for hibernation
by shutting off AMP kinase. We want AMP kinase to be active. That's how the drug metformin works. Matter of fact, the diabetes drug metformin targets AMP kinase and as such reduces how much blood sugar is made in the liver. So it's a diabetes drug. You can activate AMP kinase by taking quercetin, by exercising, by using berberine, for example. A lot of different ways to activate AMP kinase, but you certainly don't want to shut it down. And that is really the nuts and bolts about the dirty work done by elevated uric acid, far beyond making gout crystals in our toes. That's for sure.
That's fascinating. Yeah. I mean, AMP kinase, otherwise known as AMPK, stimulated by high intensity exercise, stimulated by intermittent fasting. So for all we know, I mean, for all intents and purposes, it seems to be a biochemical fountain of youth in a sense, but it's this AMP.
In the context of our modern life. Now, understand that in the context of our ancestors, in other words, in the context of 99.99% of our time on this planet, there'd be important times that you want to wait and you'd want to have a higher blood sugar and you'd want to be storing fat away because you might not have water available to you in the future.
Very interesting. So high levels of uric acid, otherwise known as hyperuricemia, right? Do we know for sure whether or not that's a cause or effect of disease at this point?
Yeah. And in fact, that's been the, kind of a central point of research for the past decade where, it started with laboratory animals, with rodents, where Dr. Richard Johnson, who at that time was at University of Florida, then moved to University of Colorado. He had rodents and he was studying hypertension, high blood pressure, and he could get them to be hypertensive by feeding them fructose. And immediately they'd become hypertensive. And interestingly, they would gain weight and demonstrate other aspects of metabolic syndrome. Ultimately, through a series of circumstances, he learned that in addition, when he fed them fructose, that the uric acid levels would go up. And he puzzled over that and finally said that, wondered if in fact uric acid may be playing a role. And he administered to these laboratory animals a drug called allopurinol, which is a common gout medicine. We use it in treating gout. It brings uric acid down because it blocks the final enzymes, anthine oxidase, which makes uric acid from fructose and alcohol and purines. And lo and behold, they didn't get metabolic issues. Their blood pressure didn't go up, et cetera. And that put a light bulb on in his head. And he ultimately demonstrated in adolescents, published in the Journal of the American Medical Association, that he could, in obese adolescents with mild elevations of the uric acid, he could reduce their blood pressure by giving them a uric acid blocking drug, and then performed a study in which he gave adult men a very high dosage of fructose for several weeks. And they, an abundance of them developed metabolic syndrome in the untreated group, and the group that got the allopurinol did not.
Wow. So
it really tended to tease out exactly that question that you just asked. There was an article written in 2016 in the a collaborative study or paper that came out of, I think, Japan and Turkey, where they said uric acid in metabolic syndrome from innocent bystander to central player. So Yeah, we've been seeing that. Hey, it turns out that obese people, hypertensives, people with metabolic syndrome, they all seem to have an elevated uric acid. We asked the same question that you just asked. Is that just cause or effect? And we now know that it is indeed this central player, because therapies that target uric acid without necessarily tinkering with other parts of metabolism bring about metabolic improvement. So it's a brand new tool in the toolbox. And it's also, I think, a brand new metric in the panel of metabolic health, like blood pressure, blood sugar, A1C, waist size, body mass index, uric acid, I think rightfully should have its place in those incredibly important biometrics.
I always love talking to you because you really bring the science, Dr. Perlmutter. It's, I think, one of the reasons why over the years, I've followed your work so closely. So how do you reconcile then? Because uric acid, like many chemicals in the body, if not all chemicals in the body, play many roles, right? And so there is some truth, I think, to the fact that it also plays a role as an antioxidant. And I'm sure because you're a neurologist, there's this interesting connection between uric acid levels and Parkinson's disease, right? People with low levels of uric acid seem to be at higher risk of developing Parkinson's disease, and levels of uric acid continue to decline as symptoms worsen in Parkinson's disease. So there seems to be this like protective effect of uric acid on the brain. How do you reconcile all that with all the research
That's really
that you've
an
done?
Excellent question. And I would say that for a couple of years, maybe 15 years ago, when that literature was published, I actually was treating my patients to raise their uric acid levels, thinking that it was, acting as an antioxidant. Maybe it would be helpful if we raise their uric acid levels, how things change. And interestingly, about 4 months ago in the Journal of the American Medical Association was an interesting article where they did basically the same thing. And they found that, in fact, raising uric acid was of no benefit to Parkinson's, and in fact was possibly associated with worsening. So
Wow.
It was an observation that there was, this issue with uric acid, and that, it may have to do with metabolism. Now, as it relates to the notion of a really low uric acid being somewhat neuroprotective, I think that is an observational study in kind of end stage individuals with Alzheimer's, and the uric acid levels can be really low. And I think you have to understand that uric acid is made not just from fructose, but also from the breakdown of muscle tissue. And once people are really moving along on that continuum of cognitive decline, they tend to atrophy, they tend to lose muscle mass. So there's not really this resource for making purines and then making uric acid in their bodies. So, that 2/3 of the purines in your body that form uric acid are not dietary. They're being it's coming from the breakdown, which we all do. Hopefully, it's a good thing to break down your protein. It's part of, breaking down cellular components to recycle them, et cetera. So that's, it's very interesting. I think that
the data on uric acid in terms of its antioxidant function as it may relate to things like Parkinson's doesn't really seem to be panning out.
Yeah, very, very. I'm glad that you clarified, because you're right. It was an observation. It's always possible that, when you see those two variables, that the disease state of Parkinson's is causing the drop in uric acid, not that the drop in uric acid is, causing the disease state that we call Parkinson's disease. So thank you for clarifying. So I want to talk about the dietary factors that can increase or decrease uric acid in the body. You've already brought up fructose. So what are some of the foods that we want to be really sort of weary of when it comes to increasing our risk for hyperuricemia, high uric acid levels? What are some
did I mention fructose yet?
You mentioned fructose.
That's by far and away.
Okay.
Fructose is the biggest player, the fructose that we eat. And, certainly there are other foods that we'll talk about, but let me not get off of fructose quite yet. There's one other really interesting sidelight to that. And that is, yes, it's the fructose that we consume, but it's also the fructose that we make in our bodies. So we actually can manufacture fructose in our bodies from glucose. It's called the polyol pathway. And think about it, higher levels of glucose can be shuttled into making more fructose, which tells the body it's time to get ready for winter. And who has high glucose? Well, pre-diabetics, diabetics, glucose levels across the board seem to be rising in our population. So we have this pathway to actually produce fructose in our bodies as yet another mechanism to prepare for winter. And it can be brought on by having high levels of glucose. It is also brought on by either dehydration or the sense of dehydration. When you are dehydrated, what happens? Your sodium levels go up. Now, this is really important. So you're dehydrated, your sodium levels go up. It triggers the formation of fructose. That makes body fat, and you can convert body fat into water.
Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.
It's stress, so we can use that as a broad-based term. So stresses are not always bad. We have good stresses, we have bad stresses. The majority of the stress that we associate with that word are negative stresses, right? So lack of sleep, poor diet, lack of exercise, work-related stress. The good stresses, eating well, strong community support, people around you that can, provide emotional, physical, spiritual uplifting.